Dr. Kornberg, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Why don't we start with your background? Where'd you start off? What have you done so far in your career, and where are you now?
So I guess I'll start in reverse order. I am a political scientist and research fellow at the NYU Brennan Center for Justice, where I lead research for the Elections and Government program of the Brennan Center. And I also teach political science at NYU. Previously, I got a PhD in political science, focusing on Congress, which will be our topic of conversation today. I've also worked on democracy and governance issues at a variety of academic, nonprofit, and international development organizations over the course of my career, throughout focusing on how we can make democratic institutions work better for those that they serve. And during the pandemic, led a project of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, which is the union of all the parliaments in the world, and the United Nations, that looked at how parliaments during the pandemic engaged with their citizens, which was a really exciting project as well. So a lot of different ways of saying that I've spent my career looking at how we can make democratic institutions and legislators in particular work better for the people that they're meant to serve.
And so what brought you to that interest area? Was it something in university? What got you attracted to, the democracy side in general and Congress in specific?
So I believe that, and I have for quite some time, that out of an interest in how human beings interact and how they come together in community, democratic institutions matter. Anytime you have a group of people that have to make a decision about how they're allocating their resources, or any other decision, you have politics. And I believe that at the center of a healthy political system are healthy democratic institutions. I think legislatures in particular are a really crucial institution to healthy democracies, and to making people's lives better. And also a reflection of society. Unlike the executive branch or other branches of government, the legislature is the people's branch. It's meant to reflect the spectrum of the views of the public and to interact with the public and engage with them on an ongoing basis. So I think it's a really interesting democratic institution to focus on.
So in terms of your work at university and beyond, your focus on Congress, what specific questions, have come up about Congress itself, and, what answers have you found, generally speaking, to that? And then we'll dive in specifics in some of those areas.
Mm-hmm. So my focus of a lot of my recent work has been on congressional committees. And that's because I think that committees are key to telling the story of how Congress works. I think that committees are the legislative concourse leading up to bill passage. And so a lot of political science, especially as it becomes an increasingly quantitative field, focuses on what you can measure. And when you're focusing on what you can measure, there's a tendency to gravitate towards the votes. And so when you're looking at the votes in Congress, there's an obvious story that emerges. And that story is a story of extreme polarization in terms of voting patterns. And I don't discount that story at all, but I wanted to look at the story behind the votes. And so that's why I looked at committees as really the legislative concourse leading up to the votes and bill passage, and a way of telling the story. The other reason that I focused on committees as a scholar is because there is publicly accessible data. So committee hearings are public. We can look at their transcripts. We can look in many instances at videos of the hearings or attend them as members of the public. That is not true for a lot of the kind of other ways in the closed door meetings that lead to policy formulation. So that's another reason to focus on committees. And lastly, committees are really a way that Congress apportions responsibility for handling certain issues. Congress is a huge organization, has a million different issues that it needs to handle. And so it has sub-organizations, like any other big organization does, that handle different issues. And so committees are an indicator of how Congress apportions responsibility and resources for dealing with certain issues. So they can also tell that story about Congress. So committees have been the center of my work because I think that they can tell us a story about Congress more broadly. Lastly, I mentioned in my introduction that I'm a comparativist. Committees are a universal legislative institution. And so they've allowed me in my work also to compare Congress to other countries and to compare some of the lessons and recommendations that I draw from my work to what's going on in other countries as well. So I think for all of those reasons, they're a really interesting focus.
Got it. And so I know you have a book that's just come out, and clearly it's focused on committees. So can you talk us overall, what is the book about? And then we'll dive into the the specific pieces within it.
Mm-hmm. So the book attempts to, as I mentioned, in the context of what we see as these hyperpolarized voting patterns and increasingly impotent Congress in terms of its legislative productivity, to unpack what's going on in the legislative process by looking at committees. How is the process working? What isn't working? What is working? And how can we reform it and make it better, kind of harnessing this understanding of what's working and what isn't. So the first part of the book walks us through how the process works today, based on many interviews with staffers and members who are in Congress today. It unpacks how are hearings set up, which witnesses come to testify and why, and what does that process really look like today. And then the second part of the book looks at what is the function of these committee hearings and when do they function. And so I look at 4 central functions that legislative scholars tell us should be the function of committee hearings. And I look at when those functions might be most likely in Congress today. And then lastly, draw some lessons from that about how we can, again, harness that knowledge about when these functions are most likely to reform the committee process and make it work more effectively in the context of the modern Congress.
So the book is mainly focused on hearings as a component within the committee system, right? So why don't we start off with exactly what are hearings? How are they set up from an actual step-by-step basis? How are the witnesses selected? How is the room chosen? Who's going to show up? Who doesn't? Can you talk us through the real life process of a hearing creation, and how much does it really vary between committees?
Mm-hmm. So the hearing creation process is, first of all, and I'll highlight this throughout what I'm about to share, is highly variable. Not just between committees, but between the different individual chairs and staff who organize it. But it really starts with the chair. So the chair of a committee has a lot of power. And one of the powers that the chairs have is to set the agenda. What kinds of hearings are they going to hold? The chair also has the power to hire and fire staff. The ranking member also has staff, but traditionally the majority has 2/3 of the budget. They have more staff that they can hire, and the ranking member also can hire and fire the minority staff. And so the chair is the one who decides, together with the staff that they have hired, what hearings they're going to hold. And there's a number of different reasons why someone might hold a hearing. One staffer explained it to me as there are hearings that are proactive. They're trying to get ahead of an emerging issue and understand something. And there are hearings that are reactive. Something happened in the news. There's always something happening. And Congress, a committee in particular, needs to come together and understand what's going on. Chairs might also want to hold hearings because of their own parochial interests. And it's highly variable depending on what district they represent. Based on their own personal interests, based on political calculations. There's a lot of reasons why one might hold a hearing. But once that hearing is decided, then the staff are really central in deciding the witnesses. And I walk through in that chapter how this varies, the witness selection process and why witnesses are selected. So first of all, as I mentioned, the chair is important and their staff is important, not only because they select witnesses, but also because of their relationships with the staff and the leaders from the other side of the party. So in committees where you have a good relationship between the staff, the majority and the minority staff, and the chairman and the ranking member, this matters tremendously for the witness selection process. The rules require that there's minimum notice of a hearing, that the majority give the minority about a week's notice, and then they tell them what the hearing will be about, and then they have a week to invite their witness. The rules also entitle the minority to one witness, but the reality is that when there's good relationships, many times what you'll see is that they'll have a lot more than a week's notice. They'll tell them in advance what's going on. And when there's good relationships, and particularly for more bipartisan topics, topics that are not the most politically contentious topics of hearings, they might even decide on joint lists of witnesses together and say, this is who I was thinking of inviting, this is who I was thinking of inviting, rather than that just one minority witness setup that we traditionally have. So that's another area of variation. And witnesses can be selected for different reasons. So for their technical expertise, that's a natural one. One of the purposes of hearings traditionally is to educate members, and so they can bring in technical experts. But there's also what I call labeled experts in the book. So I talk about different kinds of witnesses. There are witnesses who are brought in purely for their technical expertise. I call these unlabeled witnesses. These are witnesses who are not tarnished, you might say, by their previous affiliation with a political administration. They don't have a blog that has made it very, very clear how, and they've been very vocal what they think about an issue. No one really knows what there's a freshness to what they're coming to say. There are other witnesses that, and they might be equally technical experts in an issue, but they are labeled. They are labeled by virtue of some connection to some political issue, to a party, to a well-known viewpoint. And this is another reason why staff might decide to invite them. Indeed, they might say, we want the most vocal advocate on an issue. And this is particularly true in more politically fraught discussions. There are other witnesses who I call personal storytellers, who staff might choose to bring to tell their story, to share their lived experience of an issue. So it's not all about technical expertise. There is also expertise that comes from lived experience of an issue and personal stories. And interestingly, in the book, I asked members, I ended every interview that I had with a member by asking, tell me a story of a witness that really stuck with you over your time in Congress. And every single one of them told me a story about a personal storyteller witness, what I would classify as a personal storyteller witness. The WNBA star who grew up on food stamps, the journalist who lived with ISIS, the mother of a sex trafficking victim. These stories have tremendous importance for us as humans. And of course, Congress is populated by humans who were really moved by stories as well and personal experiences. And lastly, there are spokespeople for causes who come on behalf of lobbies or associations or advocacy organizations and speak on behalf of a certain community. So there's a lot of different kinds of witnesses that staff might choose to bring to speak. And there's, as I mentioned, variation in how they might choose to bring them. Is it a joint list? Is it just the minority inviting one witness? And so there's really a lot of variation. And then we get to the actual hearing itself. So there's a lot of variation in the setup to the hearing. There's not a ton of variation in hearings. Hearings stick to a pretty regimented script. They have 5 minutes per witness for the witness to give their testimony. And then each member has 5 minutes of questioning time that they can choose to use in different ways. And we can discuss that later on. There's a lot of variation in how they choose to use their questioning time as well. Hearings are traditionally held in these grandiose hearing rooms where we have pictures on the wall and passages from the Bible or other books. And the members of the two parties sit on different sides of the room, which I think is important in traditional hearings, and they kind of cast down their questions at the witnesses. So there's a lot of kind of grandiose theatricality to hearings in the United States Congress. And again, I might note, putting my comparativist hat on for a moment, that is not necessarily the case in all the committee hearings in other parts of the world. So that's traditionally how a hearing is, start to finish. And of course, happy to talk about when that does vary.
And so you talk about the witness selection. One of the things that strikes me is the relationship-driven nature of the witness selection. So who do I know? Who do I know knows X, Y, or Z? It doesn't sound like they're saying, okay, we have an issue. Let's find out who all the top experts are in the world on this issue and invite those experts. Typically, it's from who do we know that knows something about this issue? Is that typically the case, or are there instances where it's more systematic?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that the personal networks of the staff and of the chair and of the ranking member really skew and distort the witness lists. The staff, for obvious reasons, are going to invite people that they know. It's easier. They don't have a lot of time, especially if you're in the minority, but even in the majority, you know a set of people and you'll invite them. Another skew that I might note is that Congress does not pay for witnesses to travel to DC. And as a result of that, in a huge country like the United States, and especially if you don't have a lobby or other organization paying for you to travel, there is an obvious skew then towards witnesses who are local to the Washington, D.C. area, especially in the era of kind of before Zoom hearings during COVID, when obviously witnesses could Zoom in from all over the country. So that's yet another, I would say, skew in the process.
And what about the preparation of the witnesses before the actual hearing, right? So do they just show up and start talking, or is there 3 days of coaching before they go before the committee? Is there a range? What happens before they actually sit down and get the questions?
So what's interesting about this is that there is a lot of variation depending on the sector and the background of the witness in terms of how they prepared themselves before. So the staff are not allowed to come and prepare them and tell them what to say, but they might invite them, as I mentioned, because they're known for saying a certain thing. So that's an important caveat. Before they come to testify, they do provide a written testimony. The written testimony does not have to be word for word what they're going to say in their actual 5 minutes of testimony in the hearing, but it is usually largely in line with what they're going to say. It can be longer. It can include many more resources and citations and things like that. And it is also a part of the public record and a part of the public record of the hearing. What I talk about in the book is that some of the witnesses who come to testify, say from universities, feel really ill prepared. They were not coached in how to come and testify, and as a result, they don't always know how to communicate effectively to politicians, particularly when they come from, in the case of academia, a culture that trains folks to be hesitant and tentative in the way that they communicate their findings. And I talk about this in the book. That doesn't always translate when you're talking to politicians who want you to lead with the conclusion. On the other hand, when you have witnesses who come and they have the benefit of having lobbyists who are working with them to prepare them for a hearing, then they're going to come really prepared. I interviewed a lobbyist for the auto industry in my research for the book, and he told me that they do kind of murder board type prep with the witnesses, that they really grill them and prepare them for exactly the kinds of questions that members might ask. And frequently these lobbyists, sometimes they're former committee staff themselves, and at the very least, they really know the committee and they know the members, and so they might have a sense of what kinds of questions members might ask. And so this witness who comes with the benefit of having this lobbyist train them is going to be at a very different point, coming in from a witness again, some witnesses from universities do have some training, but by and large, the witnesses who I spoke to who come from universities or other sectors and don't have the benefit of this advanced training might feel ill prepared, especially given the grandiosity and the theatrics that I mentioned at the beginning.
So you mentioned lobbyists. So how many of these witnesses are actually lobbyists, or they never act, or are they never witnesses, and they're always sort of behind the scenes preparing some witnesses but not others? And how does that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as I as I note in the book, lobbyists are really involved in every step of the process, and sometimes they are the witnesses themselves, but there's also other ways in which they can be involved. Lobbyists can send suggested questions to members. And of course, as I mentioned, members have questioning time, so the questions that they ask really shape the discussion. And lobbyists also, I argue, have informational power. There's a tendency for us to focus when we talk about lobbying in the United States on their financial power, but they also provide Congress, and the committee process is just one of the ways in which they do this, with a lot of information. Congress right now relies on several thousand fewer staff than it did several decades ago. And in addition to that, the staff frequently lack a lot of niche expertise in the many very highly specialized issues that Congress needs to legislate on. And as a result, they rely on external information. And lobbyists sometimes have that really helpful information and can provide them with information on issues. And that really exposes Congress when they're relying on external information from lobbies in a way that Congress would not be exposed if it had this in-house expertise. So I interviewed an antitrust expert who is normally at the DOJ, but was seconded to the Judiciary Committee. And he told me that when he came to the committee, the lobbyists were really taken aback because they were used to interacting with these young staffers who were more easy to manipulate in a certain way. And here comes someone who has real expertise in this very niche and complex part of the law. And so he was really able to hold his own in a way, and I think that strengthened the committee and Congress as a whole as well.
In terms of the witness trends over time, right? We talked about, different kinds of witnesses. You've talked about how they're selected. Has it changed over time? There's this notion that, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, there were many more witnesses than there are today per hearing. Is that true? What's been the trend over time, among the number of witnesses, I guess, in general per hearing, and then also the types of witnesses that are called?
Mm-hmm. So this is an area where other scholars, I would note, have done a lot more interesting work than I. Jonathan Llewellyn and Sean Thoreau and others have looked at this trend over time in the kinds of hearings that Congress has, and relatedly in the witnesses who come to testify. And what they found is that there is today there are less what they categorize as exploratory hearings that are meant for kind of learning processes, and more hearings that have kind of a different purpose, a more policy and partisan related focus. And another trend that we see is that Congress is just holding less hearings than it was several decades ago. There's a number of reasons for this. And I might note that also members didn't used to spend as little time as they do today in DC. They used to live in DC, whereas now many of them are only there from Tuesday to Thursdays. Hearings are scheduled at the same time. Members have to come in and out of hearings, and members frequently sit on more than one committee. And so they're really strained for time. And in addition, Congress is hearing from fewer witnesses. So it's hearing from fewer witnesses. There are fewer hearings, and really a trend that is less focused on exploratory hearings, and more on different kinds of hearings. And again, I would lift up the work of Jonathan Llewellyn and Sean Thoreau and others in this field, really doing a wonderful job tracking that trend.
So let's talk more then about the types of hearings, since that's I think the way that your book progresses. And you talk about different types of hearings, one of which being, I think, an educational component. So can you talk through, let's go through each of the types of hearings in your mind and how they play out in Congress.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, I look at the four traditional functions that legislative scholars have identified as key roles of committees, and of committee hearings in particular. So firstly, there is the kind of educational component. So committees and committee hearings are traditionally where research is brought in and technical learning takes place. And this helps members gather information and deal with, as I mentioned, these very highly specialized topics that they need to legislate about. And one of the things that the book does is to look for each of these functions of hearings at when it's most likely. So when is Congress most likely to learn in committee hearings today? Well, I argue that this might seem counterintuitive, but the further away you are from an actual vote and from an actual piece of legislation, the more genuine openness there is for learning. Secondly, when you have witnesses who are unlabeled witnesses, going back to the different kinds of witnesses, witnesses who are not colored by their affiliation with certain well-known viewpoints or partisan politics, there is again a freshness and an openness to learn from them. And in addition, more kind of bipartisan topics and committees with bipartisan working cultures also lend themselves more to genuine kind of learning and openness for learning. And so I'll give an example. One of the things I do in the book is for each chapter on a function of a hearing, I give different case studies and examples of that. The example that I give for the educational hearing is a genetic engineering hearing in 2015 is one of the examples. So I think that's a great example because in 2015, genetic engineering is relatively new to Congress. And this is an issue that the House Science Committee, which held this hearing, is going to have to think through and think about how to regulate and think about how to fund and oversee. And so it does need to learn about it. And even though it needs to learn about it, it does not yet have a vote coming up next Thursday about a specific bill that has already been written because it's new. And they bring in experts, folks like Jennifer Doudna and others, scientists, to really just educate them about this emerging issue. And I interviewed several folks who were involved in setting up that hearing, testifying in that hearing, attending that hearing, who really held it up as an example of just genuine learning. They needed to learn about genetic engineering. And so they did that in the hearing. And it was because, as I mentioned, it wasn't about a specific piece of legislation yet. They had unlabeled technical experts. And it was a generally kind of bipartisan issue. It had not yet been colored by partisanship as an issue, and a subcommittee of the House Science Committee that had a good working relationship between the minority and the majority. So all of the building blocks were there to have an educational hearing.
So when you say learning or you say education, I'd like to dig a little bit more into what you mean by that concept. So when I think about a hearing and there's a person who I might be questioning, what is the information I'm trying to get? Is it I'm trying to learn facts? Is it I'm trying to learn problems that might exist? Am I trying to learn about solutions to problems that already exist? Am I, asking questions about the future? Am I asking for speculation about those things? What kind of, if you atomize this notion of information that's being gained by the members during the hearing, how would you break that down and to say that this was learned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question because, of course, as we know in social science, learning is a really difficult thing to try to quantify. And I should caveat that in terms of looking at learning, I try to focus on the perceptions of the staff and the members themselves about what was helpful to them. So
it's however they would define learning.
Yes, but I will break down the information piece that you brought up because I think that's really important. There's a lot of different kinds of information that members can gain from hearing and from questioning. One of them is, of course, just technical information about an emerging issue. What does aerospace exploration mean? What is genetic engineering? What is this thing? The second kind of information that is also important that is gained in hearings is where fellow members stand on an issue. So committees, I talk about in the book, are also unique because they're a bipartisan institution in an increasingly partisan Congress. They're a space where members of both parties come together on a regular basis for hearings and other committee work. And so another thing that is interesting is that members might see, oh, well, that colleague of mine, he's very engaged on this issue. He's always asking these kinds of questions. And so maybe I can work with him on this. Indeed, I heard an example that I tell in the book of a senator who introduced a piece of legislation to start a select committee on cybersecurity and was able to find a partner on the other side of the aisle because he saw that this other senator was really engaged with this issue in committee hearings, would always ask a lot of questions about it. Otherwise, he might not have identified that. And even if it's not identifying partners and potential areas of common ground, at the very least, it's a way of understanding where people stand on an issue, which is a really important piece of information. Where do my fellow members stand on an issue? How are they questioning in this hearing? Equally important. Another kind of information is, again, what I explained comes from personal storyteller witnesses, but also the engagement of members who have different kinds of personal experiences with the witnesses. And that might tell us what communities are involved in this conversation, how it will involve different stakeholders in different ways, and really kind of those implications of a specific policy debate. And I might also highlight, and I do this in kind of different chapters in the book, that it also matters. So there's the members, there's the witnesses, and then there's also the public and the media involved. That's another kind of information. Who is attending the hearing? Who is following the hearing? Who is reporting on the hearing? What kind of public awareness is there of an issue? That's another kind of piece of information that is gained. So there's a lot of different kinds of pieces of information. In the chapter on education specifically, I focus more on just members trying to understand the very, very complex issues that they legislate on, but that's not the only kind of information that they gain in hearings. And so I wanted to just clarify that piece of it.
What about in terms of the notion of problems and solutions, right? Because you could learn all about cybersecurity and then come away with the idea, okay, now I know more about cybersecurity. But my hunch is that a lot of these are preludes to figuring out what the problem, or there are underlying problems that people perceive, like in formulating the problem, right? That in theory, a legislation might be able to solve. So in these educational hearings, I'm curious, and maybe you haven't done this looking at this specific question, but how are problems formulated in those hearings? Like, for instance, would they ask, what's the problem with cybersecurity? What legislation should we make? Is it like that?
Yeah.
Or is it like, here, what are the problems going to come up in the next century? And then they start to prioritize those problems somehow. I'm curious about this notion of problem identification and prioritization. And then if the problem's already known, the same side of the solutions, what kind of solutions are potentially out there, and how do we prioritize which ones might be more attractive to pursue?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question in the context of the argument that the book makes about the function of committees as a whole in Congress. So the book starts with an introduction that talks about the devolution of committee power over the past century. Leadership has usurped control, and a lot of the power has been sucked up into party leadership that really just push down bills. And as a result, the power of committees to really, write the bills that then give the solution has been diminished. So I argue that a lot of the power of committees now lies in this agenda setting space that I think that you're talking about. Agenda setting is about figuring out what are even the problems that we need to figure out. When we talk about genetic engineering, okay, this is our new thing. What do we even need to think about when we think about regulating this emerging field of science? What do we even need to think about when we think about the farming solutions for local farmers, all these different things that are, changing and continuously important in American society. That is power that I think that committees still hold and argue that they should lean into, because agenda setting is an extremely important part of the policy making process. Is it indeed one of the first parts of the policy making process that set the stage for what are the problems that we're going to deal with. And because committees have less power in that kind of legislative stage, which I think is more of the solutions-oriented stage, I think that there is a lot of space for them to think about leaning into the agenda setting part of the work.
Well, I know that some of that legislative has come at the expense of the more show version, theater version potentially of hearings. So maybe we could talk on that second function of hearings is the theater. And can you talk us through what happens there?
Mhm. Yeah, so a second function of committees, again, and we know this really kind of historically and universally, is a public forum. So Woodrow Wilson termed committees as, quote, the theater of debate upon legislation. And there's another quote that I like by a senior staffer on the judiciary. He explained to me that sometimes, quote, the purpose of a hearing is to give a public forum to discussions that largely happened behind closed doors. So this public function of hearings helps members to publicize issues, to mobilize support or opposition for issues. And so I think that there's a tendency to look at theater as a kind of, or use theater as a pejorative term, but by no means am I using this as a pejorative term. This is really important as a function of committees. But when is this most likely? I talked about when educational hearings are most likely. So when is theater most likely? So not surprisingly, it's very different conditions from those of education. Of course, there's no use putting on a show if there's no audience. And so the hearings that have, for example, like the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, which are some of the examples that I use in the book, those had 20 million people tuning in to watch them. That's not surprisingly going to change the incentive structure of members for what they're trying to get out of that. That's huge stage for them to be saying certain things and clipping sound bites on issues. And so these highly public issues are one determinant of how theatrical a hearing is going to be. Secondly, when we have very, very partisan issues, again, different from the genetic engineering side, if we're staying with science, so more of kind of the climate change science hearings, those are going to serve a more theatrical purpose as well. You're going to be bringing in labeled experts, maybe the same climate change skeptics who are known for their views on an issue, and that's going to set up a more kind of theatrical display. And in addition, when we have kind of the hearing set up and the relationships between staff that are not kind of the collaborative joint list, but just the one minority witness, there's obviously a tendency for the minority to just want to bring in the loudest and most vocal person that they can think of if they have one witness to come to say something. And so that also influences the kind of hearing that you're going to have. But importantly, I do argue that these hearings, kind of beyond the function that they hold for how Congress is signaling its work to the public, they do have an effect on members, or they can at least. I call it the voicing views effect. So when you bring in the same people over and over again to make an argument, and I use the examples of climate change, I also use the examples of the hearings leading up to the Iran nuclear deal in the book, then that gives what one staffer called ammunition to members, verbal ammunition to members, and it really helps frame their arguments around an issue. So I talked about climate change. The chair of the House Science Committee wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about climate change, and this was following several hearings that the committee had held, and he used the argument and many of the points of the vocal climate change skeptic who had come to testify. And there are many examples of this, of these kind of known labeled experts who are coming to talk to Congress over and over again, being helpful in shaping the rhetoric and the argumentation of members when they speak both within and outside of Congress about an issue. And as we know, rhetoric around an issue is tremendously important also in shaping the kind of policy debate that happens. So these theatrical hearings where you have these labeled experts coming in and saying the same thing over and over again have that potential effect, I think, on members.
So in terms of this theatrical side of things, you know, there's two parts of it, obviously. One part is the witness's statement, and the other is the member's statement, or the member's so-called question, right, which turns into a statement. What's been your experience of these things over time? Have they changed? Are they the same? Have members, how are members' times allocated compared to the past in these theatrical types of environments?
Mhm. Yeah, so one of the key ways in which I designate in my work what is what kind of hearing is it is to look at the transcript of the hearing, and there's a number of different things that I'm looking for in coding it as different kinds of hearings, which I do for the hearings that I look at in the book. And one of those things is the questioning time. So in theatrical hearings, members might be more likely to use leading questions. So that's questions where they know the answer. They're trying to get the witness to say something and to admit something in some instances. That those are not inquisitive questions. Whereas in educational hearings, we see questions that are not gotcha questions. They are questions that are genuinely inquisitive questions. The other thing that we might see more of in theatrical hearings is members using their so-called questioning time not to ask a question, just to make a statement. They'll say that it's for the record, and they'll use a lot of their questioning time, not their 5 minutes of questioning time, to just make their position on an issue known. And as I mentioned, when there's a huge audience watching, that can be a good use of your questioning time. But even when there isn't an audience, you can clip that and put it on your website and say, in this hearing with this elected official or this administration official or whatever it is, this is what I said. I made my point. So that's I think another really important point in terms of the questioning. And another thing that I look for is, are there follow-up questions which show that you're interested in learning something? Someone says something, and in addition to asking an inquisitive question, you follow up. Or are there questions or use of questioning time that show that you were listening to the witnesses, so that you picked up on something that they said, perhaps something that even wasn't in their written testimony, and you're trying to follow up on that? Those are all signals of learning versus the kind of gotcha questions and the use of questioning time to just make a point.
One thing that strikes me particularly when it comes to this theatrical version of hearings is the fact that the majority has a number of witnesses and the minority maybe just has one, right? Even if Congress were 51-49, there's a disproportionate theater going on one side versus the other to make the debate look a lot more lopsided than it might actually be between the majority and the minority, whatever that happens to be at the time. What is your thought about how that impacts, I guess, public's perception of what's happening in Congress, even what's happening within the population, but also within Congress itself? And do you think that distorts the people's view?
Yeah, I do think that the public's view is not necessarily reflective of what's going on in Congress. And part of the reason for that is what you're saying is the kind of the breakdown of the minority getting one witness. But I would also argue that, as I mentioned, in many instances, that's not the case. It's highly variable. There's the formal processes, and then there's informal norms. And when that's not the case, it's most likely going to be the hearings that are not, the most salacious, hot topics. And the media tends towards the most salacious things, as I mentioned before. And so that's what you're going to see on television. What you're going to see on television is most likely to be the more theatrical hearings, because, of course, that's what the media tends towards. And then there's a vicious cycle where, because the media is present, then members might act even more with an understanding that the media is there. And so that's the perception that people have, is that that's the hearings that are taking place. But the reality is that there's all sorts of different kinds of hearings, and what you see on TV might not be reflective of everything that is there. I might note in that respect that I interviewed one of the members of the House Intelligence Committee. The House Intelligence Committee is unique in this context because it has closed door hearings. They are not public and broadcast because of the classified nature of what they're discussing. That committee, especially before everything that happened with Russia a few years ago, was known to be a bipartisan committee. One of the things that that members say about that committee is that it's bipartisan because there isn't that pressure that is understandably there when everything that you're doing is public. So there's more space for bipartisanship and for just having an open discussion.
And so in these theatrical hearings, do they tend towards one type of, I mean, you mentioned already about the when they might occur, right? Later in the stage of the political process, et cetera. Is it typically coming up in problem identification? Like, there's a hearing and half of them think it's a problem and half of them don't. And they're both trying to say X, Y, or Z, like climate change could be an example here. Or is it, we know there's a problem and we differ about the solution to that problem. I think Bill X is better to solve this problem, and I think Bill Y is better to solve that problem. They fight about that and take positions, or do both happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it really depends on whether the debate itself becomes contentious and more political debate early on in the process, or it's just always there, like with an issue like climate change, it's always going to be that kind of issue. But I do talk also about a trend in nominations hearings and in oversight hearings, which are kind of hearings that that might tend towards, especially in times of divided government, more theatrical displays. So with the example of nominations hearings, a few decades ago, nominations hearings did not look like what they do today. First of all, there were no television cameras there, really. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor was the first justice, Supreme Court justice, who had really televised hearings. And at the time, that was new. And it wasn't kind of this long show driven questioning that we have and that we know of as nominations hearings today. And so this is reflective of that kind of trend where right now we see nominations hearings where, again, just as a category of hearings, as you were talking about, they tend towards kind of the more theatrical and less about just, okay, let me ask some questions to really figure out if this judge is someone that we want to nominate. The culture, the working culture, I've heard from the staff of the Senate Judiciary Committee has also been influenced, understandably, by some of the rancor surrounding the Kavanaugh confirmation and other recent things that committee has had to deal with. So there's a lot of things that have changed the nature of nominations hearings. Oversight, which again, other political scientists have investigated in much greater detail. Folks like David Mayhew and Eric Schickler have looked at partisanship and oversight and other issues in how Congress works. But understandably, when you have an administration of an opposing that represents an opposing party from the party that is in control of these oversight hearings, there is a greater tendency towards bringing in administration witnesses in order to make a point about what they're doing wrong. And that's a shift. So I think that when we look at kind of certain kinds of hearings that are always going to tend towards the more theatrical, what comes to mind for me today are nominations hearings, oversight hearings, hearings about issues that are always contentious, like climate change. But of course, there are many issues, as you mentioned, that in a later stage, just related to the specific part of the law that is about to be passed, especially in the current climate, are contentious as well.
Great. Well, let's move on to another type of hearing that you've mentioned, or another type of, I guess, piece of the hearings that's important to identify as this personal connection part. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, committees are a space where members come together in a regular kind of way to engage, and as such, they have important implications for the personal relationships between members. But of course, not all hearings will lead to friendships. But in particular, certain kinds of hearings, I argue, have a potential for personal connection. So I tell the story in the book of the Agriculture Committee listening tour in 2018. In 2018, the House Agriculture Committee went around the country ahead of the Farm Bill, leading up to the 2018 Farm Bill, and held what can best be described as kind of open mic sessions with farmers and local community members to just hear from them. And what I heard from members who were on this listening tour is that it was really a different kind of interaction, unlike the hearings that I explained at the beginning of our conversation, that are set up in a very scripted way. This was more of an open conversation. And it was also more of a space when you got out of Washington to just form relationships with members. And I also tell the story of the famous friendship between Dick Lugar and Barack Obama. I interviewed Senator Lugar before he passed away in 2019, and he told me that his famous friendship with Barack Obama, which was a famous kind of across the aisle friendship and fruitful working relationship that they had, originated in their joint membership in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which Dick Lugar chaired twice, and Barack Obama was on, and in particular their trips to Russia, their trips to other parts of the world. So when you take members out of Congress, or have the kind of space for this personal connection and these hearings and hearing like meetings outside of Congress, there's even more of a space for personal connection between members. And I might also add, as is the case with the Agriculture Committee listening tour, also more space for a broader spectrum of ordinary Americans to share their own personal stories about an issue. And again, putting my comparativist hat on for a moment, one of the things that we looked at in the Inter-Parliamentary Union project that I led was how parliaments engaged with citizens. And what we heard, particularly in large countries, were similar experiences from members of parliament in South Africa and in Brazil and in Eastern Europe and in many, many other countries, that when they went and they traveled outside of their parliament, they got to hear many different stories and perspectives from folks who otherwise would not have had the resources or the connections to be able to come and testify in Congress. And they were also able to interact with each other as fellow parliamentarians in a different way. So about half of the parliaments that we surveyed in my research around the world do field hearings. They're actually more likely in big countries like the United States. And I argue that these kinds of field hearings that committees have are really important from this personal connection perspective.
And so personal connections, is it something desirable, right, among the committee members, right? I can imagine a purely transactional Congress, right, where the members don't know each other at all. They're isolated in different chambers and they're only interacting through parliamentary procedure, right? On the other hand, I can imagine they're all great friends sleeping in the basement together right before the hearing, and they're all coming out and discussing everything 24 hours a day, on the two extremes. So do stronger relationships lead to better outcomes for a committee, or and how would you know whether relationships are good or bad? I mean, obviously my intuition would say they're good, right? But is there something to back that up? Do they pass more legislation? Do they get more stuff done? Do they do less theater? How do you measure whether the relationships piece is a good thing?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers to that. So the first one is that relationships are impossible to measure to a certain extent, beyond the perceptions of them and the overarching understanding of Congress, which I think is well placed as an institution where members have really lost a lot of trust and a lot of relationships that were once had when they perhaps didn't sleep in the basement together, but at least lived in Washington and had more chances to interact socially than they do right now. And in any organization, Congress, and I continuously describe it as, just another organization of people, trust and relationships matter in getting things done, particularly in the way that Congress is set up. But another way of looking at it, I think, is to try to get at this in different ways. So I mentioned that that there's a variation in the way that the witness panels are set up. What I found, and this isn't necessarily an indicator of relationships, but it is an indicator of the kind of increasing ideological gap between members. I looked at DW nominate scores, which are a well-known measure of ideological polarization in Congress based on voting records. And the connection between that and a method that I devised called balance scores for hearings. So balance scores I created by looking at the transcripts of witness testimony for nearly 1,400 pieces of testimony from several hundred hearings, and looking at whether a witness was using more positive language on the whole to speak about something versus more negative language. I then rated each hearing based on the number of witnesses that were speaking more positively versus negatively about an issue to create a balance score. So just to make it clearer, a hearing that had 3 witnesses using more positive language based on my automated language analysis to speak about something, and then 3 witnesses using more negative language as an indicator that they were speaking against something, would receive a 0.5 balance score. It was perfectly kind of split in terms of the witnesses who were speaking for and against an issue. So that's, and I use balance scores in the book at a number of different times. But one of the things that I do is to look at the connection between the balance scores of the hearings and the DW nominate scores. And what you see is that in the committees that I looked at in the book, the committees where there were more balanced hearings were committees where the chair and the ranking member were closer to each other ideologically in terms of their DW nominate scores. And that speaks to, I think, the importance of kind of having some kind of common ground and agreement on some issues. Of course, that's not necessarily an indicator of relationships at all, but it is an indicator of how ideologically divided folks are on an issue. The other thing that I did look at was committees where, according to the many staff that I interviewed, there's more of a historical bipartisan working relationship between the staffs. And what I found was, for example, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that there was less variation than when there was a change in the party that took over and a new chair in the balance scores than you might see in other committees. And so that, again, is an indicator that the overall bipartisan working relationship of the committee, and I don't just give the chair and the ranking member credit for that, you know, the staff and the whole working culture of the committee is at play there, might have something to do with the kinds of hearings that we have. So again, that is not conclusive at all, but I think it speaks to the ways in which this might matter, and at least one way of getting at how those relationships matter.
Yeah, I think, you know, you hear a lot about the chair and the ranking member relationship being a critical component to the success of the committee, and even to, you know, whether the committee functions at a normal level, and that can, you know, decline precipitously with a bad relationship between them. Not to mention, you know, I also hear the story of new chairman coming in and changing the entire staff, in which case the old culture is wiped away. Have you done a lot of work on, you know, the chair and ranking members relationship over time, and how that actually plays out in reality?
So as I mentioned, I looked at some of the connections between that and then the balance of the witness panels. But I think what's also interesting to point out in that regard, as I mentioned, is that chairs can come in and hire and fire staff. And there's different party protocols about chairmanship, right? So we have in the Republican Party term limits for chairs, and there's a lot of really important points to be made on behalf of having term limits in any position, I'd argue. But when you have term limited chairs, and a new chair coming in, then there is more of a chance that you're going to have new staff. And then when you have new staff, as you mentioned, you lose a lot of the institutional memory and knowledge that is so critically important in Congress and in committees. On the flip side, there's many staffers who I spoke to who have been there for a long time, and they've switched minority majority, and their counterpart on the other side also switches. And that long-standing relationship allows them to create a really functional process for setting up hearings. And so I think that there's a lot of variation. There's a lot to be said for having less staff turnover. Of course, the chair and the ranking member aren't the only reason that staff turn over. The staff are living in a very expensive city, and recently in 2021, there was a decoupling of staff pay from member pay and a push to pay staff more, rightfully so, I think. But there was a feeling that staff couldn't stay and build a career in Congress and be able to support themselves and their families in the way that you need to living in an expensive city like DC. So there's a lot of reason for staff turnover, but to your point, it's extremely important to have some kind of organizational memory.
So anything else you have on hearings before we move on to the lightning round?
Not that I can think of. I think that a lot of the kind of key points I got a chance to talk about.
All right, are you ready to move on to the next section where we ask you questions that we've asked previous guests that we can sometime compare the answers?
Definitely.
Why don't we start with the notion of representation? What do you think representation should mean for our members of Congress?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really critical question, first of all, in the context of Congress, because Congress is the people's branch. Its job is truly, and the job of other legislatures as well, to represent the views and the opinions of citizens in the decision-making process. And in terms of what that looks like, I think that a representative Congress is both engaging with citizens. So I think that's one component of it. Civic engagement is truly important to what's called symbolic representation, or this relationship between legislatures and their citizens that is less kind of clear-cut than other kinds of representation. It's this dialogue between them. This allows the representatives to actually know what it is that they're representing. They need to be hearing from ordinary Americans. There's many tools that Congress and other legislatures already have to do this. Committee hearings are really a traditional one where ordinary citizens come in and share their perspectives or their expertise on an issue. But of course, there are many other ways throughout the legislative process that different members of the public become involved or meet with their members, either in the district or in the Capitol. Now, in addition, there is another component, which is the more descriptive representation, which means that I believe that the legislature should be representative of the diversity in the United States. We've made a lot of progress in terms of demographic representation in Congress. We have more women in this current Congress than we've ever had before, but that's still nowhere near the number of women that would be representative of the country. We have an increasingly ethnically diverse Congress as well, and still not representative of a lot of different demographic groups that are in the United States in terms of ethnic and racial representation and religious representation. We do not have a Congress that represents the age range of the country. The average age of members is in their 50s, and that then is not representative of a lot of the youth and young voices in the legislative process. And I could go on, but it's really just not representative demographically, and we know that. So that's another portion of what representation means. And then lastly, I would say that a representative Congress is then, because of this descriptive representation, because of this civic engagement and this dialogue and this symbolic representation, is able to get to substantive representation, which is to represent people's interests and their desires, and it is responsive to citizens. It is truly a legislature that is in dialogue and representative, and something that is not removed from public life and public opinion. I think that this kind of legislature could go a long way to repairing the very, very low approval ratings of Congress right now and levels of trust in Congress. So I think it's something that's worth aspiring to. And I think that it would really be composed of these different elements of what we think of when we think about representation.
So if I go back to kind of the various, the fundamental notion of representation, I do want to try to nail you down on at least a couple aspects of it. One is who the person represents, right? Do they represent the voters who voted for them? Do they represent the primary voters alone? Do they represent everyone in the district? What's your opinion on that side?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it's pretty worrisome that in the United States, I think one statistic that I saw is that about 80% of congressional districts are safe districts right now, meaning that they're decided in the primary. And that is worrisome just because we know that the voters who vote in primaries are a smaller group of people and not necessarily a representative group of people in terms of the entire community. So I think that representatives should represent their entire district and not just primary voters. And again, that means rethinking the way in which this system is working, because if 80% of congressional districts, give or take, are safe, then we do not have many districts that are not decided in primaries. But I think that beyond the district representation, in a national legislature, you are representing the country. And indeed, there is space, and, I'm a citizen of, my specific district, but also of the country. And there's definitely members in Congress that I look to that I say, wow, they represent this element of my identity. Maybe they look like me. Maybe they are moving forward pieces of legislation or policy that I believe in. Maybe we share different lived experiences. And many, many other Americans like me can look to members who are not necessarily their member from their district to also represent their substantive preferences, to represent their lived experiences, and other elements of what kind of representation means.
So what about future generations? Are they embodied in this representation, or are they left for future members to represent them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. As I said, I think youth voices are really underrepresented. I mean, I don't think it's clear that youth voices are underrepresented in terms of members, though we have Maxwell Frost, who's a very young member in this current Congress. That's doesn't take away from how difficult it is for young people to run and how underrepresented they are. I mentioned the average age before. That's reflective of an entire pipeline and a process that disadvantages young people and makes it harder for them to run. The United States is not unique in this. A lot of parliaments struggle with having more young members. Some parliaments have instituted quotas for young members. That has been helpful. And then in terms of the kind of the future, I might again bring up a foreign parliament, which is Finland, is really unique in having a committee on the future. They actually have a committee in their parliament that is kind of like a think tank and thinks about kind of these bigger picture problems that maybe you might not have a chance to think about when you're just in, a committee that has to deal with immediate agriculture policy issues or transportation issues or what have you, because most committees in most parliaments, including Congress and again in other legislatures as well, are really just focused on a specific policy issue of the day. And so that's one interesting approach to thinking about the future. And I also think that having more young people in Congress can help represent this kind of generational shift as well. But in short, to go back to your original question, I do think that that in representing the substantive hopes and opinions and perspectives of Americans today. That includes all of these people's hopes and aspirations and opinions about what world they want to create for their children and for future generation of Americans and global citizens.
So for this notion of representation, obviously you're very inclusive, and you also mentioned that there's this concept of groups or identities is important in the representation process. What about the idea of beliefs versus judgments on behalf of the constituency? Do you think the representative just be mouthing what the constituents are, their current beliefs are, or should they be making judgments that they think are in the best interest of those constituents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really core question about what kind of democracy we're living in. We are not living in a direct democracy where citizens are the ones making all of the decisions. We are in a representative democracy system where we are electing representatives to represent our interests, but we also are electing them, at least in the way that I approach representative democracy, I think, in order in kind of in a way that is putting trust in their judgments on certain situations. And in our current system, members also get to learn about and specialize and spend all of their time digging into these issues that everyday constituents might not know about. Legislating is a job, and they learn the job. And they have access through committee hearings, through congressional support agencies, through other things, to all of this information and all of this expertise. And so we, I think, put faith in them in representative democracy to be, on the one hand, having an open line of communication with their citizenry and engaging and understanding people's desires. On the other hand, being open to a real deliberative process where they can hear from different opinions and reason through the different aspects of an issue. And then the third part is actually, them doing their job of learning about an issue, of understanding how to pass a law and how to move things forward in the current Congress. So that's kind of their job, to hold, I think, these three pieces, and not just, again, that would be a direct democracy system if they were just there, to just completely do everything that the opinion polls of their district said. Right.
Great. So next question is around congressional time. So where should they spend it? Should it all be in DC? Should it all be back in their district hanging out with those constituents? How would you break it down? And how would you break it down among, committee time versus doing other things?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting because I'm not alone in arguing that the congressional calendar needs to change. Right now, we have members who are there only, 2.5 days a week. And as a result, they can't really fully engage in anything, and definitely not in committee hearings, which they're in and out of because they're scheduled all at the same time. So I think that there's creative ways to get around this. Of course, there is a concern, which I completely understand, that if we make even less things need to take place in DC, then members are going to spend even less time there. And even more time in their district. And as a result, they might lose the relationship building component of being there. And they might lose some of the engagement with the legislative process and their job actually legislating that they're already not spending a lot of time doing. So it's a delicate balance, because of course, there's real importance to being in the district. And also it's just what ends up happening now in any case. So in terms of a solution for this, I think that there can and should be more field hearings that allow members to come together and learn about something, and actually have the added benefit of engaging with citizens who are not in DC and cannot afford to travel to DC, and engaging with them in their space. And some more travel like this together could be helpful, and it also can help members build relationships outside of the echo chambers of Washington, D.C. I know from members that I spoke to in my research how critically important it is, these trips that they take outside of Washington in terms of building their relationships with each other and having shared experiences. So this kind of field hearing, and again, mixed in with other hearings as well, but more field hearings outside of Washington can help account for some of this. More Zoom hearings. Zoom hearings were happening during COVID, and now the current Congress rolled that back. And that is, in my opinion, at least, a shame, because many witnesses who could not otherwise afford to come to DC, which of course Congress not pay for, had access to testify. So that increased that kind of democratic part of the process and hearing from citizen voices. And also the Zoom hearings allowed some flexibility for members who could maybe fully engage with the hearing if there was a little bit more flexibility around what time it could be. And it wasn't just Tuesdays or Wednesdays, 10 a.m. Or 2 p.m. like most hearings are right now. So I think creativity around when hearings happen and where they happen can help members to truly engage with the committee process and help members to spend time together. But I do believe that in a huge country like the United States, we cannot expect for all of members' jobs to be only in DC. And again, I'll bring in other country examples. In other large countries, there are also many field hearings. There's a lot of parliamentary work that entails going back to your district, traveling the country, understanding what the entire country wants, including your specific district. And again, that cannot happen only in the capital in a massive and diverse country like the United States. So again, I think it's a mix, and I think it's about breaking the mold and getting creative with where and how you hold committee hearings and do other kinds of work.
Right. So the next question is really about the debate, deliberation, dialogue. Where should those things occur? Should they be on the floor? Should they be in committees, in hearings, in markup? Should they be exposed and transparent, or should they be private? Should they be in bars? Where should this interplay happen between members, and where they're trying to convince each other or pitch to each other different ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my book, because the book is about committees. And committees are really traditionally in legislatures, and again, not just the United States, where deliberation and specialization and deep discussion is supposed to take place. And they're set up for that in a way, because again, you get to hear from a spectrum of different viewpoints. You have a kind of smaller group that can deliberate about things. But one of the things that I chart in my research is the decline of deliberation and the decline of the kind of deliberative potential of committees. Because as committees have been starved for resources, and as they have lost some of their power in the process, as a result, they also have less of a kind of deliberative and specializing space as well. That being said, not all hope is lost for committees. I still think that they can be a real space for this. And one of the things that I argue, again, based on my research, is that they can be more deliberative when you have better relationships between the chair and the ranking member and their respective staffs, and more bipartisan topics. The topics that we might hear about on the news are the most partisan topics, and then we see the hearings about them, and they're the least deliberative hearings. And that, makes sense, that we would think that that's what hearings are, if that's what we see. But many hearings look different. There are hearings in committees that are still deliberative in nature, and that might be more likely when you have, again, better relationships and bipartisan topics. Why is that? Because the majority really has a lot of power in setting up hearings. The chair and the chair's staff decide the agenda, decide the large majority of the witnesses, and that leaves the minority just minimum notice in terms of the official rules and one witness. And that's not going to make for a real deliberative witness panel. If you just have one witness, the minority, whom they might choose, to just have the most vocal person with most zeal, who can, counteract all of the 3 or 4 majority witnesses. But if you have better relationships, what I've heard from staff is that, especially on hearing topics that are less fraught, you can have a real collaborative approach to the witness panel. Who are you thinking of inviting? Who are you thinking of inviting? And create one of the key components of deliberation, which is having really a lot of different perspectives at the table. And so that's why the relationship element in terms of how they're set up is key. And I actually show this then in my research. I construct what's called balance scores, which look at how balanced a witness panel is based on sentiment analysis of the transcripts. And I show that for bipartisan topics and on committees that have more bipartisan kind of culture in terms of the relationships, you have more balanced witness panels. So I do think that there's room for deliberation in committees. It might be less than there was a few decades ago. And when it is there, it's more likely in certain circumstances. But I think beyond committees, there is also space for deliberation and debate and dialogue outside of committees as well. And I mentioned trips outside of DC. So I think that kind of field hearings or congressional delegation trips are a really great place for members to learn and to engage in dialogue outside of the real kind of partisan vitriol of Congress today and halls of Congress today. And in addition, there's a lot of roundtables and briefings and webinars and places where members can just bring their lunch and have like a little brown bag discussion where they learn from a scientist or where they really dig into a topic. That happens, and just like in any other workplace or any other environment, it's a great place to learn and to discuss. And the lack of kind of formal structure is really important, I actually think, in order to facilitate that more organic discussion in those settings as well. And the other benefit of those settings, to get to another part of your question, is that they're not public. Those settings allow members to move away from needing to put on a show and just kind of relax and learn about a topic and engage with each other in order to be productive. One of the things that I learned in my conversation with members was about how unique the House Intelligence Committee is in that regard. It's one of the only, it is the only committee that has closed door hearings. So what that means is that the media is not there. And as a result, at least before everything transpired with Russia and everything in the past few years, it was known to be a very bipartisan committee. And that's not a coincidence. These settings where you can just relax and you don't have to be filmed are important. Of course, it's nuanced because transparency is a critical part of democracy, and citizens deserve access. Committees are one of the only public spaces right now. You know, all of the closed door meetings with lobbyists or with citizens are not something that is public. That's actually one of the reasons that I study them, is because you can get a lot of public data. So we still need them, and we need that data. We need that for democracy. But we can also have other spaces that allow members to do things that they can't necessarily do in contemporary hearings and contemporary committee settings, which are so public, and in many instances, because they're so public and because of access of television cameras to Congress, also extremely theatrical. So a long-winded way of saying that there's, I think, a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity and a lot of different places where we can still find deliberation, dialogue, productive discussion in Congress.
It sounds like you're an advocate of both, some kind of private venues and some public venues, rather than being, extreme on the transparency side.
Definitely, yeah. I think that I think the name of the game is just nuance and creativity when it comes to these things. And right now, the bulk of committee hearings in Congress look exactly the same. And there's a lot of rigidity to that. And I think that we can break out of that. And I think that we can do the same when it comes to other kinds of meetings.
Oh. Great. Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's just so many. So many wonderful things that are already going on in Congress as a result of the Select Committee on Modernization and other initiatives. But I think that one thing that I've been giving a lot of thought to, because I've worked on civic engagement, is really, just to circle back to our point about representation, ways that the legislature can better engage with the full spectrum of American voices. Congress can go a long way in facilitating this. I think it can learn from other legislatures that, for example, allow for many members of the public to comment online or suggest amendments online to pieces of legislation. There are other legislatures that allow people to send in videos of sign language also to suggest amendments or make comments on bills, and make it even more accessible in that way, and to call in for folks who don't have access to internet. There are parliaments around the world who have regional branches, where that helps make parliament visible in that part of the country. There are legislatures around the world who translate their hearings into local languages. The United States still has a Congress that works almost exclusively in English, even though that is not reflective of the language diversity of this country. And the Puerto Rico Status Act, for example, I think was relatively unique in the sense that they had, public meetings to solicit input on that act in Spanish as well. But we can be doing a whole lot more of that in Spanish and in other languages. And we can be doing a whole lot more to really institutionalize civic engagement into our parliament. Other parliaments, again, have a team dedicated to civic engagement that helps the parliament learn and isn't beholden to a specific chair and their specific relationships on that committee or a specific staff member. They have databases of local community groups that they can tap into when they want to learn about something across the country and across different issue areas. And they have local experts who understand the culture and understand the languages, who they can also consult when the parliament wants to learn about something. They have more, speaking about schedules again, there are parliaments of large countries that have schedules that allow them to have 1 week in the constituencies, and then several weeks in parliament, and not have that back and forth travel. So there's a lot of things that Congress can do in this regard, and can open itself up and learn from international examples. I think frequently in the American democracy discussion, there's a sense that everyone needs to learn from Congress, and Congress is doing some wonderful things that should be held up. But there's also a lot of space for humility and for us to learn about what other countries are doing. And I think there's a lot to be done to strengthen the civic engagement infrastructure, to strengthen the way in which Congress understands and engages with citizens so that it can better represent them. And when we think about one of the biggest hurdles of Congress, which is that it is just not very popular. People don't trust it. They don't approve of it. And as a result, many of them, are disillusioned and disengaged. That's critically important to repair for democracy and for Congress as a democratic institution. And civic engagement is a part of that journey. So as a long-term piece, I think that is one of the most important ways that we can really strengthen the democratic resilience of the country as a whole, and especially of Congress.
Right. Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with regard to congressional reform?
Yeah, that's a really tough question for me, because there's so many wonderful pieces of scholarship on this. Like many other scholars, obviously the work of Richard Fenno is really instrumental. He really was one of the first people to start thinking about things like congressional committees in a systematic way. The other thing that I appreciate about Richard Fenno and have taken with me in my work is this, what he called the soak and poke approach, where he really immersed himself in Congress in order to understand it, really soaked himself in it, if you will. And I think that there's a tendency right now of political scientists, and I've written about this as well, to only focus on what can be counted in Congress, and just log on, download some data about votes, and think that you understand Congress. And of course, that is tremendously important to study, but it is also important for you to immerse yourself and speak to the people who are there and try to get as much of a sense of it as you can in order to understand such a complex and ever-changing institution. I think that in addition to kind of Richard Fenno's iconic work, and I would also add Nelson Polsby's iconic work, also a political scientist who really shaped the field. I think that more recent work by Francis Lee, by Sarah Binder, by others has really been impactful, because I think that they encourage us to view Congress as a as an ever-changing institution again, and take an approach that in their scholarship that encourages us to look at the way that Congress has changed. Eric Schickler does this in his work as well. And again, I'm just listing more and more names because I think that and of course there's many others, because I think that really my work always stems from and is in conversation with work that has come before it. I think that the legislative studies field is changing in a great way right now to actually think about more questions of representation and different ways of approaching things. And I think that that's great because I think that there's ways to innovate this and ways to look at things that haven't been looked at before. I'm really excited to remain in that conversation and to see how scholarship about Congress continues to evolve.
Well, you're anticipating, of course, the last question, which is what's the future for your work? What do you have on the horizon? What big projects do you have in the works?
So I just published a book about committees, as I mentioned, inside congressional committees, and that work really underscored for me the importance of working on congressional capacity, and that's what I'm continuing to do. The work really showed how much congressional capacity needs to still be strengthened. And of course, the Select Committee has done a lot of this, and I've worked also internationally on this issue, and I think that there's a lot to be learned again internationally. But my current focus in terms of my current research is really how we can strengthen congressional capacity on science and tech issues in particular, and look for ways to fill the void of like the dwindling power of committees, the defunding of the OTA, and other things. And so what I'm looking to do together with colleagues at the Brennan Center is kind of gather information about the current gaps. That's what we're trying to do in our current research, and do so in the hopes of making some recommendations that are more policy oriented in terms of how this can be strengthened.
Excellent. Dr. Kornberg, thank you so much for your time and best of luck with the new technology area.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.